First, sorry, Chris, but it looks like you won your spot on the mobile team, so you didn't tank. If anything, I felt like I was learning an awful lot that we can use, and he was a very kind of person we often need on planning teams dealing with coastal issues, because it's a depth of knowledge, within that particular range that most planners don't have, because that's not what we spend our time worrying about. What we do spend our time worrying about is, at least on land, to some degree on water, what belongs where. We worry about other things, we have other kinds, the skill set. But fundamentally, the real mindset for the planner, correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, is what belongs where. So that's part of what I'm going to talk about. And we also teach, as Elizabeth mentioned. I'm not going to try and squeeze a semester into 45 minutes. I've learned a long time ago not to even go there. But I am going to talk about some of the planning issues connected with coastal areas that we have to worry about. So think of this presentation a little bit sort of like a symphony with these, a little bit of a slow, quiet overture at the beginning here, and then it gets a little louder and more complex as we move along. I'm going to just introduce you very briefly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Most of you all know this. But just start setting the stage by talking about some of the specific hazards that are unique to coastal areas that we don't worry about elsewhere. I've spent a lot of time worrying about all the other hazards as well, wildfires and tornadoes and all those other things. But that's not obviously necessarily relevant in most coastal areas. Some of the unique features that we have in coastal areas and what I call the fatal attraction. Why do we live there in the first place? And why did we build cities there in the first place? There's a reason. And that working waterfront connects with that. So from a planning perspective, there are reasons we have cities on the coast. There are reasons we have cities on rivers. In fact, as I try to tell my students, you can find me a place that has no hazards. You give me a reason why you want to live there. So on the coast, well, we've got, wind hazards. Obviously, we won't spend any time here, but we know that we have cyclonic storms known on the East Coast as hurricanes. On the Pacific is typhoons. Out in the Indian Ocean is cyclones. We can't seem to decide what we want to call these things, so we found different things in different places. But up here also, those of you in Boston are involved, where another kind of storm called a Northeastern can do just as much damage sometimes as a good hurricane. So those are, at least bring some wind hazards in terms of damage to buildings and creating an uncomfortable environment. By the way, one of my introductions to Northeasters, just as a personal story, in 1997, Red Wolf Mountain in Vermont. Any of you familiar with the area? It's actually the site of a writers' colony, writers' retreat that's held every year by Middlebury College. And I was there that summer, for 11 days. Beautiful site, up in the mountains, sunshine, all that. And then one day comes one of these storms. I couldn't believe it was August. Literally. I mean, that's the only time in my life I can remember sitting in front of a fireplace in August, trying to dry out after getting drenched, just going between buildings in that little campus. Obviously, coast means water. So we've got water hazards. We've got storm surge. We've got coastal erosion. We've got this whole problem with, issues with estuaries that Chris did a fine job on. I'm not going to repeat all that, but I'm setting, stage. What is it planners need to think about in terms of adapting to coastal areas? Because, as we all know, when we do, these planners have been involved in local hazard mitigation planning. The first step is identify your hazards. And then we've got this emerging one. Chris was showing you some of the area around North Carolina, and this is, of course, the Nags Head area with various levels of sea level intrusion or sea level rise in that area. Do we know exactly when we hit each of those landmarks? Well, obviously not. And some of it's influenced by, these big decisions we make about how we're going to try to affect CO2 level rise in the atmosphere, and so on. All the things that go into this, as well as a lot of other decisions about development along the seacoast, all of which Chris covered a lot better than I will attempt to do. And then we've got geological hazards, which we didn't spend as much time the first time, so I'm going to mention these very quickly. Not much of a factor on the East Coast for the most part, but they could come with tsunami. Yes, I was in Sri Lanka, as mentioned, and this is the remains of the Yala Beach Resort and Hotel after the tsunami struck the coast of Sri Lanka. All they see left is the foundations. 250 guests and staff lost their lives when the tsunami struck in here. Did it have to happen? No. Guess what they had done? This is the only development that was allowed in the Yala National Wildlife Reserve in Sri Lanka, a big area reserved basically maintained for the benefit of wildlife and not humans, but they allowed this one hotel to be built there. In order to, and they made them build a low-rise hotel because they didn't want something that was towering over the jungle behind. So in order to create a better view of the ocean out here, the Indian Ocean, what did they do? They tore down the building. A case of development decisions radically impacting the results of a natural phenomenon like the tsunami. Probably, it would have been a much milder impact if they had not made that fateful decision. And then bluff failures. In areas where you have steep bluffs, and particularly if you have development in the back and various kinds of other impacts, what those impacts may be can vary from one place to another. Whether it's agriculture, development, paving, cutting into the slopes, draining groundwater, all sorts of things have an impact. And I don't even remember exactly where this is. We certainly know about this on some of the shores of the Great Lakes, which is our third coast, we like to call it. So all of that feeds into why we produced the report that was mentioned, Planning for Coastal Disaster Recovery Next Generation. One of the things we have to keep in mind from a planning standpoint is not only is there this geomorphology that deals with how the land moves based on all these impacts, but from a preservation and conservation standpoint, the shoreline is also, not only is it geologically dynamic, the most dynamic in the world, it's also the biologically richest in the world. That interaction between land and water produces some of the greatest biodiversity on the planet. I remember reading some of Rachel Carson's early works, beautiful pieces of work. She didn't just write Silent Spring, though. You got to read some of the stuff she did to see around us and some of those late 1950s works where she explores this relationship of the shore and the land and the rich biological heritage of those areas, some of which we've managed to undermine over time. It's also an area that has some special opportunities for green infrastructure. All the civil engineers among us to help think through this issue with the planners. Where does green infrastructure belong? Where will it thrive? Where might it best work? But it certainly is a special opportunity in many cases. And then when you get to this question, why are we there in the first place? There's also this issue of humans have always loved this interaction with that ocean out there, that vastness and power of nature. To be on the edge of that somehow, it touches us in some spiritual way that makes us want to live there. Whether or not we happen to have a job that fits that need to be there. So there is this fatal attraction that puts us there. And, you know, Key West. Why are people in Key? You ever been to Key West? You quickly find out why people love being there. Now, it's granted, the highest spot on the island, speaking of sea level rise, is only 18 feet above sea level. You know, not very high. So when the storm comes through, a good deal of Key West, if it's a direct hit from a hurricane, it's going to get swamped. But all the 99% of the time that that's not happening, God, is that gorgeous. People love being there. But when it does happen, when those storms come through, then we get some of these other results. The rest of this is Hurricane Sandy, but the Atlantic City Boardwalk in shambles. This was there after Sandy a couple months later. That iconic little roller coaster. This is having a brainstorm. There's a roller coaster out there. This was actually sitting on a pier that collapsed. A lot of damage in areas where people wanted to be. Now, this is Seaside Heights sits on one of those barrier islands. There's that long barrier island running the length of New Jersey. The Jersey Shore, heavily developed. We're going to talk about that as we move on. But there's more than just that fatal attraction of, you know, just the beauty of the thing, and wanting to be in these areas, and, you know, with all the ticky-tacky amusements that are in Seaside Heights. There's also jobs. There are reasons why we build it. This little statement from International Maritime Organization at the United Nations sums it up. 90% of the world's trade is carried by sea. Why? We'll think, what are the alternatives? Can't fly it. People can fly. Products float. That's how they get there. So we build ports. We build, you know, working waterfronts to move things around. We have commercial fishing. People, you know, where else is a commercial fisherman going to go? That was one of the questions we faced in Sri Lanka when the government was talking about a setback. We don't want to live that far back. We want to be near the coast. How do we make our living? So there are practical questions involved in the fact that we put cities on coast for a reason. There are good reasons why there's a port in New Orleans and a port in Norfolk and a port in, you know, and on it goes. 50,000 jobs, port in New Orleans. So here I want to stop and step back because this is really a question, the central planning question. What is a disaster? It seems like a simple question, but we really need to get to the central answer. It's a natural hazard event colliding with the built and human environment. You had an uninhabited desert island out in the middle of the Pacific and a storm went over it. Would there be a disaster? No. There's no natural, it was just a natural phenomenon. I like to ask my students before Ponce de Leon came through Florida, looking for the Fountain of Youth, were there disasters in Florida? There were hurricanes, but there were disasters. Somebody inevitably points out there were some Indians down there, and you know, how much developed real estate was it? You know, yes, I mean, it affected, you know, a relatively small number of Indians, but so the real question is Chris mentioned himself, you know, this interaction between development and the event, the storm, or the tsunami, or whatever it is. No development, no disaster. So the central issues we get to, this is like, what I'm about to tell you is like telling you, this is a short book, it's only got 2 chapters, each chapter is 500 pages each. There's, you know, bottom line, where we build, how we choose to build. So that gets me to an interesting question that confronted me back in the fall of 2005. I had a reporter from this CNN who called. And she had a simple question for me. Should we rebuild New Orleans? Yes or no? And I said, well, you know, it's not quite as simple as that. Probably there are parts of New Orleans we may not want to rebuild. There's probably other parts we should. There are a number of reasons why people will want to come back. There's the Port of New Orleans. There's a whole, you know, it's not a simple yes or no question. It's a very context-laden, complex question. And I get all through saying that. So Mr. Schwab, rebuild New Orleans, yes or no? At which point I hung up the phone. I just said, I'm not, well, actually, I didn't hang up the phone. I said, I'm not going to deal with the question on that basis, and she hung up the phone. Yeah, but people were asking that kind of question. It's overly simple. It doesn't get to all the kinds of issues that we're going to confront here. So I said it was going to get more complex as we move in past the overture here. So some of our modern planning and zoning challenges. Well, one of them is, well, how dense does that development get and where, given that we are going to have New York City and we are going to have Boston, and we're going to have cities on the coast. And some of the cities need to be protected, or parts of the cities need to be protected in various ways. So what do we choose to do in order to, make the most sensible decisions? In some cases, there's the issue of relocation or building back on site. There are places where you can relocate people fairly easily if they're willing, and some places, because you have the available land, and some places where that's not an option. We're going to talk more about that. And so then we have the question of what options do we have for living safely near the coast? How much of that involves some of these kinds of decisions about building drawings and seawalls, et cetera, that may otherwise compromise some of the natural movement of the coast? There are issues of governance. I'll get into that in a minute, but basically how we choose to run our communities has a big impact on the results and the outcomes from coastal disasters. There's the issue of infrastructure and capital improvements, where we put things, not just where we put housing and people, but where we put roads, where we put utilities, all sorts of questions like that. I was fascinated. One time I was about 10 years ago down in Corpus Christi and saw over Corpus Christi Bay, there was this causeway, and there were these utility poles, and they weren't straight up. They were kind of leaning this way. It looked like there had been some impact over time from various things. And sure enough, a few weeks later, after I get back, somebody's calling from Corpus Christi with a question, the planner, and I asked him about that. Well, we do have this committee that from the planning department that meets with whatever the utility is every couple of weeks. And maybe we'll bring that question up, and I'm like, okay. Are you ready for the next hurricane when it reaches Corpus Christi? Appropriate uses, what belongs where? That's the basic question I started with. And then how we match. In order to reach some of these conclusions, we need a lot of data, right? We need to know a lot of information. You just saw how much information there is on geomorphology before we get to some of the other issues we need to know. Some of the input from engineers, input from biologists, a whole range of, there's a big need of professions and disciplines working together. This is an interdisciplinary problem. We planners certainly begin to touch a lot of these issues on our own. So we need to start matching some of those resources with planning needs in order to make intelligent development decisions. So let's start with the density. Why are we there in the first place? Well, we've got a lot of reasons. Like I said, water-dependent uses in industry. There are various kinds of things, human activities, that absolutely have to be they have no other better place to be because they are related to that waterfront. And you can think of it. I mentioned that, those coastal fishermen in Sri Lanka. There are also coastal fishermen down along the Gulf Coast and in North Carolina and all sorts of places, and it's a big industry. Just go down and check out all the shrimp boats down in Louisiana. I've been down there. There's a lot of them, and it is a big deal. How many of you eat shrimp? Probably everybody in the room, except for the vegetarians. We've got ports and tourism that generate 50,000 jobs connected to the Port of New Orleans alone. I don't know what the numbers are, in some of the other places like Boston, but I'm sure they're substantial. Some of the highest value real estate in the nation is sitting on the coast for all the reasons stated above. So how close to the shore do we build? Well, we do have some choice about this. Some of it is a choice that's compromised by past decisions, and some of it is a choice that we can still make. One of the nice things about Chicago, and granted we don't have hurricanes, but we do have other, there are storms on the lake that can produce some pretty high waves, and there's some, you could envision a lot of opportunities for damage to buildings and people from coastal action on Lake Michigan under the right circumstances. But without particularly thinking about the issues we're talking about today, a guy named Montgomery Ward led a civic campaign in Chicago, and this was the Chicago shoreline here, to create this shoreline park that we enjoy for 20 miles of the coastline, all the way from the upper northern border down to Indiana. And when those waves kick up, they're hitting all this green stuff in parkland and not these buildings that are set back here. And you know what? Much like Central Park in New York, did this hurt real estate? No, it helps it. If you got one of these buildings that's sitting back behind the park, it's even more valuable probably than if it had been sitting on the coastline in the first place. Except that, obviously there are other cities where we've already made that decision to let people build right on the waterfront. This is a fierce battle. If you were to start talking about trying to develop some of this land in Chicago, you should watch the fierce politics that unfolds over what was promised as, clear and free forever along the lakefront. So we do have some choices here, but sometimes we've already foregone some of those choices. So I want to go into detail in one specific example. There are a lot of places I could have picked, but New York had Sandy to confront 3 years ago. And they did some interesting things that I think are worth looking at closely from a planning standpoint. So I did this article. This is a publication of APA, as you can obviously see. This is our Sandy anniversary issue in November of 2013, which I did, which is titled High and Dry on the Waterfront. And I spent some time talking to the New York planners and looking at the documents they had produced and the plans that they had laid out for dealing with the issue. Really, it was amazingly complex when you start digging into the details of what you have to think about to help New York City recover from an event like Hurricane Sandy. Some of those issues. Number one, we have height limits in zoning ordinances. I started out with a story of one guy from New York University who actually lived in a small burg up the Hudson River that had not made any adjustments to its height limits, and some of his house flooded partly because they hadn't allowed him to elevate, so he just sort of elevated utilities in the kitchen to preserve them from flooding, but in fact, they had problems. Well, in New York, to his credit, Mayor Bloomberg had the sense to issue Executive Order 230 and suspend the limits on heights in areas affected by Hurricane Sandy to allow homeowners to elevate their buildings to comply with elevation requirements of the National Flood Insurance Program, so that they didn't get caught between a rock and a hard place between the zoning laws and the NFIP rules. And as many of you may know, the NFIP says if you have substantial damage, more than 50% of a home is damaged, you're going to be required to do some kind of mitigation. Elevation is one of those options. Now, if you need to go up a couple of feet and raise the building, and that, the height limits in the zoning code didn't allow it, that took care of it. In case you're wondering, height limits are and can be a very contentious issue in zoning. Because, if you think about it under ordinary circumstances without this context, I'm on a residential street, I've got a 3-story residential single-family home. Do I want my next door neighbor to be able to go up 5 stories? Hell no, right? I don't want a certain reasonable level of development in the neighborhood. And there are certain other areas where they can put up, that they're zoned properly for the 15-story apartment building or whatever. And so, there are legitimate reasons for height limits, but under these circumstances, adjustments had to be made. Then they had to adjust to the new flood maps. What does FEMA do after one of these events? Well, they reassess where the flood lines are and what predictions, would apply for the future in terms of the 100-year event of 1% annual chance of a flood reaching a certain level, and that affects who's required to get what flood insurance. It affects flood insurance rates. All this actuarial business comes into play. But one of the things we also know is that in many communities, those flood maps are rather old, and then they have to get updated. When they get updated, people get upset because they find themselves in the floodplain that they weren't in before. They probably, in reality, they were in it anyway, but they didn't realize they were in it, and they didn't have the flood insurance issues kicking in until they found themselves on a different side of the line. Well, New York, the state flood maps in the city dated back to 1983. Needed updates? You betcha. Of the buildings that were just, and of course, different building codes applied depending on when the building was built. So to build a newer building, you're building according to the current flood, building codes today. Something built back in 1930 was built with whatever codes existed at the time. Does that influence how well buildings are structured to withstand the damage? Of course it does. 98% of the destroyed buildings and 94% of the damaged buildings were built previous to those flood maps. They were not built to the current standards. We find this frequently in many kinds of disaster situations. Go to California, things that were built many years ago before current seismic standards don't withstand earthquakes as well. This is a common phenomenon. So it's another issue they had to confront. They had out of the 8 million people in the city, many of them are in areas or in high rises or whatever where they're not affected by flooding, but they had over 200,000 people in mapped floodplains according to those 1983 maps. Now you will see that number changed when the new maps came out. And so these new ADFEs, adjusted base flood elevations, FEMA's remapping following the event, made for a big adjustment challenge that they had to face. Now, when you add all that up, being in newly in the floodplain when you weren't before, mapped floodplain, and I put that in quotes because the water is going to go where it's going to go anyway. Changing flood insurance rates, changing requirements, building codes, all those factors when you're building. There are some equity questions that start to arise with regard to who can afford to live on the waterfront. And then you get these howls of injustice and inequity, of course, because people of lesser means are being forced out and other people are moving in. So one of the challenges for results, here's a map of the Rockaways, and you can see that the Rockaways has changed a bit over time, and all of this, dredge channel, where does that dredge go? It looks like Chicago, a lot of our lakefront is filled in. And so you've built on a lot of that. On this little peninsula that extends west from the area around JFK Airport live 180,000 people. That's bigger than a lot of our cities in the Midwest. That's a whole city in itself, all on this little stretch here that's just a part of the borough of Queens. When it got hit by Hurricane Sandy, of course, it was trapped between Jamaica Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. An awful lot of damage down here, and plus, the fire in Breezy Point. The fire start. How does the fire start in the middle of a hurricane? It's salt water that knocks down a building. The wires short out. Sparks go. Oof, goes up, and then the fire sparks can't get in there. In fact, one of the bridges for the IRT, the subway service, was knocked down. So those people were even more isolated after the fact. So you can see some of the vulnerability that is built into a place like New York. Think about New York. There's only one part of New York that is part of the mainland, the Bronx, and it's a peninsula. Manhattan, an island. Staten Island, Long Island for a reason. Long Island, Queens and Brooklyn. It's all island. So in their search for solutions, I thought they did a great job, frankly. They did a couple of important documents, one called Urban Waterfront Adaptive Strategies. It was something that they funded with a grant from HUD, just so you know where that all came from, as part of the Sustainable Communities Program at HUD. And what they wanted to do was look at some of the alternatives for specific types of waterfront in New York City. And Chris was talking about all that geomorphology. Well, when you look at the complexity of the New York City waterfront, 520 miles of it is more than many other cities combined in terms of the amount of waterfront that they have to look at and deal with and strategize for. It's not all the same. There are wide variations in the nature of that waterfront and the nature of the alterations that have been made by human development and groins and seawalls and all sorts of other things that have been out there. Some of it actually looks relatively natural. You saw that cover of our PNS report on post-disaster. Guess where that is? That's Brooklyn. I've asked people repeatedly, can you tell me where you think this cover photo came from? Nobody ever says Brooklyn because they don't think any part of Brooklyn looks like that. So there are wide variations. So what they did was break this report down into a series of strategies for different reaches of the waterfront, given existing conditions and the amount of, the development that was being protected, if there was any. How much elevation? Some of it's actually got bluffs, some of it's, relatively flat. A variety of existing conditions, as well as a need to anticipate some changes in future conditions as a result of things like sea level rise. So they looked at the strategies. In the case of upland areas, some elevation for buildings, flood walls, maybe waterfront parks if that was feasible to clear out an area and preserve it as open space, or possibly retreat if that's workable. There's not a lot of land to relocate vast numbers of people. As much as I might like to think that it would be a great idea for Rockaways is simply one big nature preserve, ain't going to happen. 180,000 people living there don't want to move out of the Rockaways, and nobody's going to make it. Maybe they have some good reasons for staying. The shoreline areas, you can see a different set of solutions, and then some of the in-water areas, another set of solutions, including things like constructed wetlands, some of which were already discussed. So there's a variety of solutions, and it really gets down to the fundamental thing that I've always thought about planning, which is that it is very, very contextual. Context means everything in fashioning an appropriate solution in a specific place for the future of a community. So in their search for solutions, they also developed another guidebook, shorter one than the waterfront strategies, called Designing for Flood Risk. This is more oriented to architects, landscape architects, planners, building designers. One of the things they noted was, I said earlier, within the 1983 mapped floodplains were 218,000 people. Well, when FEMA reworked the map, suddenly the number goes up to 400,000 people affected by those maps. 340,000 jobs located in that mapped floodplain. More than 16,000 companies. I mean, there's a lot going on there within the 100-year floodplain under the new FEMA flood maps. So obviously a lot of that is going to stay right where it is, and the question is how best to adapt to that situation. So we've got building design that is, in their case, they had four things they wanted to foster through this approach. The visual connectivity of the neighborhoods. One of the things that can be affected severely with not well-planned elevation strategies and so on is, you know, just a visual impact on the neighborhood. So you want to, you know, be able to keep a neighborhood that's visually attractive and has some visual connectivity. Facade articulation. One thing you want to do when you raise a building up, if you go up 8 feet and you just, all you do is put up a big blank wall, what does that do to street life as you walk by those buildings? So facade articulation is another piece of this, you know, trying to maintain some aesthetic attractiveness when you make these adjustments. Having some inviting access to the building, there are design solutions for that, and maintaining some kind of neighborhood character so that, you know, if you go down to the lower 9th Ward in New Orleans, in areas where the building suddenly went up on stilts by 10 feet, what happened to that old front porch? Neighborhood, you know, the neighborhood character kind of gets lost in the bargain, especially when lots of people disappeared and the space between buildings got longer. Yeah.
So can I ask about that?
Yeah.
So my mom lives on the Connecticut coast.
Okay.
She lives in a neighborhood now where there are a number of houses being put up at least 1 story above ground. And it's turned the neighborhood into this really weird mishmash of houses that haven't been elevated, and these houses that are incredibly high. And on top of it, they've also, it's expensive real estate, so they're also building much bigger houses on the slopes. So it's not just that they're creating elevated bungalows, they're creating elevated mansions now. So is that a failure of governance in that case? I mean, from a planning point of view, what's happened there, or is that?
Well, it sounds to me like there probably is some failure of governance. I mean, New York City, one of the things they're trying to do is make sure that they don't end up with that hodgepodge. It's instead you do these things in a way that maintains the viability of the neighborhood. I'm going to show you some examples in just a second. But yeah, you know, left to its own devices, you can end up with, and one of the things that's also the terminology that partly came out of Katrina, I'd heard it before that, but it got used a lot down in New Orleans, was because you had some houses that just never got rebuilt. So you ended up with empty lots. And then you had others where they did, you know, the adjustments or whatever happened, and became known as the jack-o'-lantern pattern, because the lights are here, the lights are here, and then you have these dark spaces in between, sort of like, you know, pumpkin on Halloween. Yeah, it's a problem in terms of the desirability of the neighborhood when you get all done with this. So anyway, there was also another report that came out of this mayor's special initiative for rebuilding and resiliency. I won't go into that, but basically took a lot of the ideas from these other two and then tried to find ways to apply them in the context of the rebuilding strategies.
Question.
Yeah.
I think for the opinion that those disasters like the construction was a failure of government.
Yeah.
I would say it's a professional failure on behalf of the architect of engineer.
Well, there's that too, but the reason I'm saying failure on the part of government is because you can get at those things with some of the, you know, zoning and building code rules from City Hall.
It's not only the zoning building code rules, but the architect or the engineer should study the history of the area where the floodplain had occurred many years ago.
Sure.
In the Waterways, I built houses there. I never have a basement. I elevated everything at 5 feet. And during the Hurricane Sandy, they were the only ones who were high and dry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, the fact that if you have enough architects involved, and each going their own way with the solutions they come up with, you can end up with a hodgepodge.
We have a very vulnerable area for flood and whatever you mentioned. Why these architects and engineers have a basement? Before the building is completed, you've got a swimming pool down there.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm not going to question that. Basements are not appropriate in some circumstances. You don't find basements. You don't even know how to water. Yeah. You don't find basements in New Orleans for a good reason.
You can put it if you know what to do.
Yeah, if you flood-proof properly, etc. But so some of the other alternatives here, these are all illustrations from designing for flood risk. You know, some of the architectural elements. okay, so instead of a solid brick wall as plain old cement, you can have some of this, articulation to create some visual difference. You can change the stairway to make it appear more inviting, and rather than just having some, kind of ugly entrance imposed on this. You can put some shrubbery in. Basically, what they're trying to do is, through a series of illustrations, show some of the means of adaptation here, even though the building is ultimately up like this, however many, there's probably about 5 or 6 feet in it. Those are people. Nonetheless, you can still, with a little thought and a little work on the part of the architect, as you said, you can come up with some solutions that don't create a neighborhood that, becomes undesirable, which then, ends up having a number of other consequences down the road. So some of the other key issues that they had to face after Sandy, because this, it's not just the design issues, there are also big financial issues. They had the awkward timing that in the summer of 2012, Congress passed legislation known as the Bigger Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act. Just a few months before Sandy hits on Halloween of 2012, and you get trick or treat. So you had new flood insurance rate maps coming out from FEMA. That's part of the routine after a big storm like that, to take another look and do the remapping, reassessment, and very often in those situations the flood maps expand. Once in a while they go the other way, but particularly in urban areas where a lot of development has impacted the floodplain and reduced space for runoff and so on, the tendency is for the floodplain to expand. That then brings, as you get moved further into the floodplain, the rates go up, and those increased insurance rates produced a lot of political blowback. And then Congress backtracked in 2014 and undid some of its reforms in 2012. There were some basic issues. One of them was that Congress never really touched on issues of affordability in terms of flood insurance in the process of trying to fix the actuarial soundness of the NFIP. So some of they actually were almost inviting the feedback by not paying attention to that issue in order to ease the blow that was going to be coming in the years that followed that act. And little did Congress know that something like Sandy would happen within a few months of the passage of that act, before FEMA even got most of the rulemaking done. So then there were questions. It's a long political story. Won't go into it here, but suffice it to say, it created some really awkward situations. In New York, 75% of the policies were what's known as pre-firm, meaning they were issued for buildings built before the flood insurance rate maps were created, which means that they had subsidized rates. Those subsidized rates under Bigger Waters were intended to go away when the house was sold and passed on to the new owner. And, suffice it to say that fed some of that blowback. And then, on the flip side, some of those premium increases in terms of the cost of the insurance potentially, in some cases, could make elevation more attractive, because you're actually trying to, as you elevate, you can actually lower your flood insurance premiums by getting the living space of the building up above the base flood elevation. Rates are based on your relationship between that building space, the usable occupied space of the building, and the base flood elevation. If you're above it, rates are cheaper. If you're below it, rates start to go up higher. So they've got a number of examples of these kinds of adjustments within there. I won't go into these in great detail, but I do recommend, if you're interested in this, you can download this. Just Google "designing for flood risk" and it'll pop right up, and you can download the whole report. Same thing with urban waterfront adaptive strategies. Both of them are readily available. And you can take a look at the specific consequences. As I said, this all gets very contextual depending on the situation. Now, one of the other problems, as you may note, are you going to elevate this? Nobody's going to elevate this. you elevate single-family houses, but you're not going to elevate big apartment buildings like this. So what do you do with those? Floodproofing, or you build a wall around it, or some kind of protective structure. But it's another adaptive strategy. Now, moving beyond New York, I spent a lot of time on New York, but it's a really interesting case, a very complex case. There are some other approaches that I think are very promising from the planning field in terms of dealing with these kinds of problems in other cities. Baltimore has done something that I think is really out on the frontier, and we're really looking at this as closely as an example of where we need to move with, large area planning in big metropolitan areas in the future. Basically, they decided they were not going to do separate plans for all these, get into a whole series of different plans for different purposes. You get climate action plans, you get climate adaptation plans, you get hazard mitigation plans. And a lot of times you've got plans that aren't talking to each other. This is a big issue that we have confronted in one report on the hazard mitigation. The whole point of that was to start talking about the integration of these plans in some meaningful way. I could do a whole 45-minute talk just on that, but that's not the point here. But what is the point is that Baltimore decided it didn't make sense to do a climate adaptation plan separate from the whole local hazard mitigation plan, when the whole point is to identify future hazards. How are, the existing sea level rise, coastal storm, other kinds of flooding hazards affected by changes in future conditions, when that should be in here, in this local hazard mitigation plan, and trying to assess what needs to be done, what are the effective strategies. Most of these local hazard mitigation plans that are done for FEMA under the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000 are very backward looking. They're looking at historical projections without adjusting for future climate conditions. If you put the two together, you have a much more forward-looking plan that's anticipating the kinds of infrastructure changes and zoning and planning changes, locational changes that you need to be making in communities as vulnerable as Baltimore or Norfolk, as the other example was. So that, I think, is really a great move forward. Likewise, never mind what the governor says in Florida, there's no climate change, and you can't, tell state employees are not to use those two words together. Nonetheless, there are communities on the ground that have to face the problem anyway and don't really care about that. They care about confronting this. And the Southeast Florida Climate Compact is 4 counties, Dade, Broward, Monroe, which includes the Florida Keys, and Palm Beach, combining forces, as it says, to make a joint commitment to partner in mitigating the causes and adapting the consequences of climate change. Another area that's out on the front. And what's important about this compared to this is the regionalism approach. There's a lot of places we have trouble getting people together to work on joint regional solutions. Here they've said this is the only way we move forward. Oops. There it goes. As opposed to problems with fragmentation. I'm just going to talk about this briefly, but when I was traveling through New Jersey, and I was down there a lot after Hurricane Sandy, we did a whole series of training workshops in New York City and New Jersey at the request of our chapters in those areas after Sandy, and it went through, particularly this area along the coast. You can travel those barrier islands up here, and here's this barrier island that's maybe 3/4 of a mile wide, and every mile there's another sign saying, "Welcome to the borough of such and such." So you've got a municipality of less than a square mile, probably just a couple thousand people at most, each having its own planning and zoning authority. New Jersey basically gives planning and zoning authority to every township in the state. So every one of these mapped areas has its own planning and zoning authority, including all these tiny little towns along the coast. And the fragmentation that results from that is incredible. I don't even have time to go into the detail on some of the frustrations of, for instance, county planners. This is Monmouth County. Trying, because they don't have any authority over anything, but they're in an advisory commission. Now, this is a unique situation in New Jersey, repeated in Michigan, maybe one other state, Pennsylvania. But nonetheless, the issue of governmental fragmentation and how that affects our ability to respond to disaster is a profound one that we're going to have to confront. We also have to plan for infrastructure needs. Just a few little samples here. We've got about 60,000 miles of coastal roads in the United States that are already exposed to flooding. We've got Hurricane Sandy that caused over $10 billion in damage to coastal roads, rails, tunnels, We're involved actually with consulting firm Lewis Berger on a study for Transportation Research Board on transit resilience, big issue in places like New Jersey and New Orleans. How do you keep the transit system functional in the face of these kinds of challenges? So you can see some of the challenges that we face in the future. We have the potential to spend hundreds of billions of dollars poorly if we aren't paying attention to some of these sea level rise and climate change issues that may confront, if you're building a bridge or a road for the next 40 years, do you not want it to be able to withstand the climate conditions projected for 2040 instead of just 2050? If you don't think there's a spider web of transportation routes and effective roads along the coast, just take a look at the Gulf Coast. This is not unique to the Gulf Coast. We've got a lot of sunk investment here. This is an area where I think there's a lot of potential collaboration with civil engineering profession. So how do we reach, match those needed resources to do all this planning with those kinds of local governments that have to actually do it? One of the ways that we've tried to do that is to just generate some resources that can be freely available. And that's one reason we teamed up with, I'm not representing NOAA on Digital Coast. NOAA runs Digital Coast. I'm representing APA on NOAA Digital Coast. That's okay. I just wanted to clarify that point. Because Digital Coast is actually a partnership of 8 national organizations. We're one of them. The other is the Association of State Floodplain Managers, the Nature Conservancy, a variety of interdisciplinary perspectives on coastal problems. And the reason it's called Digital Coast, basically to provide resources online. Partners serve to vet many of these and to help develop them in cooperation with NOAA, providing tools and data and training, and you can see where you can get some more information on all that. One of the things we did was a needs assessment survey. There may even be some planners here who took that survey, but we got about almost 700 responses. Now, out of a membership of 400,000, that looks smaller than it really is because not all of those 40,000 members live on the coast in the first place. We don't actually have a way of figuring out exactly what that number was, so we didn't have a defined universe very clearly because of the nature of the membership records. But it was actually a pretty decent response for what we needed. And we served, it was a lengthy questionnaire, pretty detailed. It's all online. You can take a look at the questionnaire. But we asked them about their data tools, training needs, some of the constraints they faced, et cetera, to get at these issues of how can we better equip communities to deal with these issues. There you can see the list of the top 6 issues that they listed in terms of problems. Big surprise, land use planning at the top. So, what do we do to match these resources with the planning needs? One, the regional cooperation that I talked about. We have also been partnering with other organizations and trying to work with NOAA and others on developing some new approaches. One of them focused on trying to integrate climate change information into capital improvements for programming, and we're taking a much more regional basis to our approach than we have done with some of those other studies that were more national in nature because the problem is much more regionally defined. And so we're working with folks in Chicago on one current proposal. We have another proposal trying to get some funds in a different direction that deals with the Great Lakes and the East Coast community and so on. Basically trying to get, create some new resources that are useful to planners in specific types of communities. So we have these tools for coastal planning that are certainly part of Digital Coast. Visualization tools, helping people get a better mental image of what they're looking at in terms of the changes in their communities, and so on. You can kind of get the idea. Some of the more popular tools that showed up on the survey from Digital Coast recently. There's also training available in coastal resilience and other topics. A few other examples of the types of things that are up there. I like this land cover atlas that lets viewers, see regional coastal change analysis, land cover data, or changes and trends. There's actually, there's at least 30 different tools up there in addition to other data resources. Very quickly, we also have financial tools. These are all ways of leveraging change to get to where we want to go. And then the need to raise public awareness, to bring the public with us on all of this. That's a big topic, and we've got a proposal into FEMA right now trying to help develop visualization tools in cooperation with various technology companies to help people visualize what a rebuilt community could look like instead of just rebuilding what was already there. So example of some of that visioning, that's not a coastal example, but a very well done one. Cedar Rapids has been a bit of a poster child for flood recovery in our post-disaster approach. And there's my contact info. Right at 2:30, so maybe a couple questions.
Any questions for Jim?
Yeah.
In California, we've been multi-hazard planning for at least the past 3 cycles of FEMA and FIP stuff. But one of the things we're starting to advocate for climate adaptation has been the use of transit development credit programs, so that as disaster areas are identified, there's a structure in place to locate out of those. What are the planning tools you would recommend using? What do you think about TDR, TDC programs, and something better we should use folks to?
Well, exactly what you should use in a given situation, again, very contextual. TDR has appropriate uses in certain situations. It does, for those who are not familiar with transfer of development credits, development rights, basically means that someone over here has a property in an area where we want to de-emphasize development or reduce the level of development in order to induce them to give up some of their development rights over here where we don't want it to happen. We let them sell development rights to someone else in a receiving area that we consider more appropriate. What that does require is a certain amount of government sophistication in running that market. And so that's not always the case. I'm not sure, in some places where I would even attempt it, California does have a lot of government sophistication compared to some parts of the country. You may not believe it if you live in California all the time and see all the flaws, but you go to Mississippi or some other places and you will see that you are way ahead. As for the all hazards approach, I think you guys are in the forefront, whether you believe it or not, compared to many other places, because I've seen the whole range across the country in the status of the kind of planning that gets done. That said, we actually, in the hazard mitigation report, we had a study that was done by Cal Poly with the California Office of Emergency Services, and there are still a lot of gaps, even in California, which is promoting the integrated planning, basic hazard mitigation plan, synonymous or closely related to or closely referred to with the safety element in the mandated local comprehensive plans. All that stuff nonetheless, there were about a third of the planners in a survey that they did in this study that did not know what the relationship was between their safety element and the local hazard mitigation plan in their community. So if that's the case in California, think what it is in Missouri or some other place. So we have some distance to go. There's a lot of work. This most recent post-disaster report doesn't repeat this, but in the original report we did back in 1998, for example, the first so-called Green Book, we had a section that was basically a big list of planning tools and their applicability to various types of disasters and circumstances. There's a whole full-page matrix, which gets at the question, a lot depends on context as to what's applicable where, and under what circumstances. So there's not a simple answer as, should everybody use TDR? Probably not. But there are certainly places where it's extremely applicable. And, we keep saying, all planning only is very contextual. There's no cookie cutter planning is as good as no planning at all. Because there is no one-size-fits-all in this business. It's a very, you have to customize planning solutions to your own community based on local conditions. Other questions? Would that be it? Yes.
So, when you actually look at the actual process of the planning and zoning, where does financial risk actually rank in the entire process? Because in my experience, what we've realized is that when people are actually told the actual fiscal value of the losses that they're going to observe, it's when that they actually get off their feet and do the actual stuff instead of being forced upon doing something. So when you're talking about all the tools and stuff, you actually have ways to visualize financial risks that can occur in a coastal area because of a certain hazard.
Yeah, I think there are ways to do that. I think the bigger question that you're raising is how well do we communicate that information?
Exactly. So
I think we still have a long way to go in doing that. And some of the language we've used has gotten in the way of the average person understanding what it is they're talking about. So when a person hears, well, this is the line for, the 100-year flood. First off, we start out with this term 100-year flood. And somebody's thinking, well, that just had that flood last year, and that means it's another 99 years before the next one comes. That's not what it means. It means 1% chance every single year, and can you have two of them in a row? Yes. Iowa had to ask itself in 2008, how did we get two 500-year floods in 15 years? We just had that same thing in 1993. It's because they don't understand, most people do not understand the statistical concept.
Right.
Involved there. So it's tough because, you're trying to convey numbers that are sort of abstract ideas in the first place. You've got to find some language that gets there. Now, one that I thought was kind of helpful was if you multiply those numbers year by year, take those statistical chances over the life of, say, a 30-year mortgage. You just bought a house, and it's located right here in relation to that floodplain, and it's got this 1% annual chance. Well, guess what? How long do you plan to stay there? 1 year? If you plan to stay there for the life of the mortgage over 30 years, it's actually got a 27% chance of flooding. And at that point, when you're looking at it better than 1 in 4 shot while living there for half of a lifetime, comes a horse of a different color. But we don't often communicate it that way. So we do need to find better ways to get that message across. And then, of course, in terms of the alternatives, what would the alternative look like? Because people, they remember what the neighborhood looked like before the storm hit. What would it look like if we did something differently is another matter entirely. That's what the FEMA project that I mentioned, that we're waiting for the contract and getting all that set up. But we're partnering with UC San Diego and the National Schwab Institute on that. basically to try to pioneer some ways of presenting visualizations of the rebuilt community with the better solutions that people can see at public meetings and say, that doesn't work half bad, I kind of like that solution. And then that becomes more operative in moving public policy, whereas a purely abstract concept of the rebuilt community might not be very motivating.